those brought up in extremely deprived backgrounds with no discernible moral code beyond survival, which is one of the basic predispositions, to deny them the rights to marry because of fears of violence within marriage, to deny them access to certain occupations like the caring professions where the risks are just too high, and to incentivize them to join the military. So who's the minister who's going to lead off? Oh, disarray in the government ranks already. Maybe I'll just give you this because that can be picked up easier. Yeah. You're now on Nalsar.
So we are introducing the bill, so in which we are denying them those people who are disposed to violence, denying to right to marry, and encouraging them to join the army. So the reasons are that they are genetically disposed to the violence, and we are pulling them to make a group where they can their genetics ability can be utilized to the most of the efficiency. So other point is why we are doing this, because we believe that we can utilize their genetical behavior in a most efficient way by making them soldiers. And yeah, because we didn't think of it.
Yeah, the basic idea somewhere is we are coming from Aristotelian teleological, what he says, the idea of teleology, telos, that one has a purpose. So as it is evident from their genes, they are somewhat aggressive in nature, so that is why they are best serving as a soldiers. So in that way you are protecting the country, the society. So as a taking utilitarian idea, it is well argument, and that is why we are saying we are denying them marital rights, because if we are providing them family system, they will be somewhere more emotional, and as a soldier we want them to be aggressive so that they can serve better. So, and that is what number of time practices, that is something a prevalent practice. If you trace the history, a lot of examples we can come across. This is another point. And yeah, one addition you want to add something? Yeah, and ultimately the purpose of any government is to create a society where there is no conflict of interest. So if we are providing one who deserves, who is best at what, so we believe there will be no conflict. So we can utilize our resources in more proper manner, well manner, so that output what is coming will be something more good. So
the next point is that even if we are closing and denying them some rights, we are also giving them preferences over others to join the army. Like we are inviting them, like not other who are genetically and not violent enough to join the army. Like, I mean, we are giving incentives, preferences over other people who are not genetically violent.
So basically the government has a responsibility towards its citizens to protect its citizens. It has a responsibility to reduce conflict and introduce harmony. And these people shouldn't complain because they're doing it for their own good. And it's not as if they won't have a place. They will actually have a highly valued place in the military. Okay, maybe in the police as well.
So the point that I believe the government's making here is that because these people are predisposed to aggressiveness, they would serve society better if they were drafted in the military. Now, the first argument to just counter that would be, now if they have a predilection to aggressiveness and they are in the military, how do we know that this aggressiveness is not going to act out against, say, their cohorts in the military itself, say their officers or their colleagues, right? So there is obviously an assumption we are making that they can be disciplined even within the military. Now, if they can be disciplined to act aggressively only in certain circumstances, we believe that they can also be disciplined in other manners as well. For example, the same level of discipline could be exerted on them to serve society, say, in other forms, not just to be drafted into the military. Also, as we saw a little earlier in this class, your genetic makeup is not the only reason for why you act in a particular way. You have your genotype, you have your phenotype, and you do have the environment that also significantly influences how you act. So in this case, if we could create an external environment that possibly helps, say, suppress this aggressiveness, the gene of aggressiveness, or make it act out only in certain, or control it in some way, that would help them also be a part of society in more ways than just being in the military, which I understand is a very sought after sort of position, but it shouldn't be the only thing they get to do. Also, as we saw, one of the genes that is inherent in everybody is the aggressiveness gene. It just so happens that they may have a reason to act out more than others, maybe. I'm not sure how that exactly works, if that could just be clarified. And are we assuming that just because these people have a proclivity to act out, others who also possess this gene, maybe not in the dominant form that they do, would not act out, say, when they are tested, when push comes to shove? And we believe that extremely stringent, say, laws, make it as harsh as you can, would also prove to be an effective deterrent when it comes to preventing this gene from manifesting. Because whatever said and done, there is that minimum rudimentary cognitive ability that we talked about that would rationalize this. So, yeah, so that's the argument here, that even amongst the non-aggressive, there are outliers that act out aggressively. We're not addressing them at all, are we here? And also, as an additional point, I think a multicultural society with people of all genetic makeups and types is essential for human development itself. And the government does not get to decide what kind of people are right for society and what kind of people are not, and what each person should do. That's bordering on authoritarianism, which I don't think is a good way to run society or structure society. And also, just one more point, I think somewhere in the proposition it was also said people who were extremely poor or socially backward may possess this gene in a more dominant form. Was that one of the points that was made? If I'm not wrong, I don't think I understood. Okay, so we're not assuming that certain sorts of people, because of their social background or economic background?
We're assuming that you have a bad genetic disposition and it's not cured by
Society.
good cultural upbringing.
Okay.
So there's no redeeming features.
Okay, so we're assuming both things don't work for you. You have bad genetic makeup and you have a cultural environment that's not helping you. In that circumstance, wouldn't it make sense for the government to step in and say possibly do something to cure that environment for the individual? Because, Okay, so this legislation is an extreme measure, and if you're going to implement such an extreme measure, it should be the ultimate step that you take. And there is nothing here to show, and if you could prove that to us, that corrective measures have been taken, or something has been done before this, and it has not addressed the circumstances enough that this extreme step needed to be taken. It can't be the first measure that you do get to take, right? So that's our argument. It should be the last resort.
I'm sure they're going to say this is totally utopian, too much costs.
I don't know about that, but last year we did this course, criminology and penology. We had this case study, like this research study by Cesar Lambroso in 1971, which talked about his main thing was criminal man, that how criminality is inherited, and then certain physical attributes that existed in almost majority of the criminals that there were, like it existed. Or the other thing she was talking about is like what I can think about, like from that class, those classes only, is nature and nurture thing. So social conditions also do exist, but like nature is the most dominant thing here, and the nurture comes much after it. Yeah, the nature of like the genetic structure or the architecture of the gene is much more dominant here. It should be taken into consideration. So what we've seen in the study is like more than like around, what I remember, the majority of the criminals that there were genetically unfit or like something like that. So there's a strong reason behind, like, yeah.
So we are also denying them right to marry because as they are predisposed to violence, when they will marry and reprocreate, I mean the gene, dominant violent gene is, there is a possibility that will transfer to their children also. The possibility of more violent persons in the society, so better to keep them in the army and utilize them.
So I know I'm not supposed to intrude as the Speaker of the Parliament, but I'm going to abuse my position as the Speaker of Parliament. You're saying that you can control for a bad genetic disposition by having the government invest in providing an appropriate cultural environment that will hopefully override your bad influences or impulses. What do you think of that, government?
Like I'm firstly adding to few more points in our support, that the legislation is somewhere talking about collective measure, like it is somewhere in the interest of society. So if we are providing them the chance in military, so it is ultimately serving the society, and at the same time it is serving them because we are providing them all those incentives and all those measures.
They might be aggressive within the army.
Yeah, so for that also, like we have the culture, like we are providing them a proper discipline, we are nurturing them there, and a proper culture, and at the same time serve both the purpose. Like we are not only taking their services to do some fight works, like they can be used, like for example, there are a lot of examples, like military is serving for this in natural disaster flooded region, so in that way we can use them. So yeah, Nisha, you can add on that point.
The whole point is that even say in army, you're talking about, see, the kind of schooling and the nurturing that she was mentioning. You need to nurture them, and it is what are the odds that if you're in the society and you're not being nurtured in a specific way, in a disciplined way, that you are going to be in the army. So the possibility is much higher if you are in the army. It is going to be nurtured in a better way.
So, but if they can't be nurtured and it's too late to invest in cultural supports, let's say they're too far gone, and you don't trust that they can be properly disciplined in the army and they might go rogue, do you reach for another extreme solution? If, let's say, you want to reduce levels of violence in society, and what's that other solution? Or maybe you'd say this is You're saying this is an extreme solution. You presumably would say it's not. There's worse to come. Okay. Do you want to? Okay.
And then like mine can be the finishing. This is just in response to what she said right now. Let's say you've put them in an environment where you're giving impetus to their nature of being aggressive by putting them in the army and capitalizing on that. In that situation, they're still not removed from society. They haven't been isolated from society. So when you put them, so let's say they're, in one situation, they're part of the military environment, and then they've come back to the society. Who's to say that the impetus that they've received to that gene is not going to manifest itself when they're interacting in society as normal members? And how do you justify the cost of dealing with that then? That's one of the points that we have.
So her point is just that they're not being ostracized. At some point they will come back home, and then if that gene acts out, then we're not really doing anything to curb that situation, are we? And this is just another afterthought that I had. It's really not a point in the debate, but if we're not going to allow these people to breed, we're curtailing the gene of aggressiveness itself. And so eventually a military will also run out of people with this gene, right? Because there's nobody with the gene anymore. So then you're going to draft regular people in the military after that. So it's a very temporary measure just to eliminate a certain sort of people. That's essentially what's happening here. That's extremely harsh, I think.
Yeah, so I'm assuming that you're going to be conducting sort of clinical tests to determine what is genetically pure material. So in that case, you're going to see a sharp drop in participation in these tests because for one, people are going to be afraid of discriminated against, and secondly, that's going to narrow access and creation of new research technologies and a potential cure to whatever malformation there was in the gene. Secondly, you can't genes don't write your entire biography. You can't say that they predict your entire future down to the last minute detail. So if you're going to go in for such a complete ban, who's to say you're not going to take it further in the future? So are you going to cull an entire set of the population because you find out they have an inheritable fatal disease rather than waiting and sort of potentially resolving it through future tests involving them in the participation?
So the government is heading in the direction of genetic cleansing. That is to say, ordering its society in terms of favoured genetic features and disfavoured genetic features. And you're saying that's futile because you need genetic diversity in order to be able to actually improve genetic stock. And the army itself needs aggressive people, and therefore if you're genetically cleansing that out of the gene pool, the army itself will not be able to fight any wars into the future. Okay? Do you want any last comeback before I hand it over to the Human Rights Commission? Non-Human Rights Commission. I mean, the ultimate in genetic cleansing is extermination, right? And killing off strands within the gene pool. I would say, this is just sticking my neck out, a prediction, genetic tests will probably become mandatory within the next 5 to 7 years around the world, probably ostensibly on a basis of assisting the government engage in health planning and in allocating resources to meet demographic changes and so forth. So watch that space. Any last comment from the government? You didn't engage on the issue whether you could invest in cultural supports to, as it were, control for a bad genetic disposition. Presumably you're going to say the budget can't handle that or something like that. Or it's not your job.
I'm loud, I'm very loud.
Okay.
I render this thing with voice. But isn't it assumed when we said that we're going to identify somebody with a bad gene pool, that there is a process of identification, and once there is some identification, there will also be some strategic action taken so that they will
Yeah.
And today we know that there is a particular gene which controls color blindness. We know it. And some of us are waiting for that gene which will tell that, okay, this is the gene which controls dyslexia. So once we know that, there's nothing wrong with designing what I'm coming from as after age.
Yeah.
And the fact that we have identified something to be not suitable for society. We don't see it as a bad person.
Yeah.
Or immediately itself.
Yeah.
And the fact that we cannot control the social environment in which a child will grow.
Not really.
Identify that, there is automatically a process in which we are assuming that there is a process in place so that we can work on them in terms of their culturalization in the society.
Yeah.
And therefore, we are seeing there is an incentive position for them in
See, the debate about gene editing has manifested itself in the context of designer babies and parental rights, but the next obvious step is the government itself nudging the gene pool in certain directions, and you can see why there's a logical reason why they would want to do that, but the question is, are there reasons why they should hesitate? And that's why we have a Human Rights Commission. So let's just hear.
It's okay, go for it without the mic, yeah.
All right.
last point. We don't want somebody with color blindness to be drivers, right?
Well, you know what?
Right? You don't want them. You don't want a pilot who's not 6x6, right? And if you knew that there was a gene which could predict, I'm not saying a gene which could cause, but a gene which could predict that condition in future.
But you know the American black singer, he wrote the song, Isn't She Beautiful? I just can't figure his name. He's blind. Stevie Wonder. He has a pilot's license. He has to be accompanied by somebody who's seeing, but he actually has a pilot's license. For a small plane, not for a Boeing 737. Yeah.
Also, it seems like we are trying to enforce the whole idea of normal. What is normal? As a normal and fit. For example, even in the era of technology, I feel that I am more comfortable reading on a paper rather than my laptop. But my end goal is whether I am able to grasp and understand what the text is, irrespective of what the means I am using. Right? So, like, I'm able to, maybe I'll understand the text by hearing the audio, but I may not be using the paper or technology. The means may be different, but the end goal, if it's achieved, I think the whole idea of normal shouldn't be enforced.
You qualified, you know the name. No, I'll say it first and you say the second one.
Right. So just like to qualify my earlier statement, it's not that we're against genetic testing in full, but we'd like to say that we are for it, good for us. A lot of new technology is going to come out of it. We're just saying that you don't take it to its ultimate conclusion and halve off an entire part of society because of that, right? So mutation is the touchstone on which evolution occurs. We need mutation, we need genetic diversity, right, to be in our society. And I think law is sort of in favor with us on this because there is a US federal law, the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, which prohibits your employers and your health insurance from discriminating against you based on the results of your genetic testing, right? So,
Yeah, that's all. It doesn't per se prohibit genetic testing itself, just prohibits discrimination on the basis of it.
That's really interesting because I've actually written a book on genetic discrimination, which I'll bring to you tomorrow. Human Rights Commission.
Is it a decision or is it a...
No, just give your opinion.
Oops, okay. No, so I think the onus on the government is obviously heavier because they have to defend restrictions
restrictions on marriage choices as well as employment choices. I would say a more reasonable way of framing the motion, if you really were looking at it as an adversarial exchange, was to perhaps separate marriage and employment decisions, because obviously it's much harder to defend restrictions on marriage decisions. But
testing for sputum samples is also quite unheard of. But we know that apart from its medical use, these tests have also now gotten into the employment context. So the kind of scenario which Professor Quinn is giving is actually more likely to happen sooner than later. And just to draw an analogy, a few years ago there was also this discussion about whether or not people applying for government jobs should be put through polygraph tests to test whether or not their disclosure about their previous work experience is accurate or not. And in the US, of course, they have a polygraph, they have a law which prevents they have a law which goes the other way around also, which in effect used to compel people to sit.
The argument. That's personal choice I'm not so sure about anymore, because with the advent of big data, you are what you consume and the digital trail that you leave, and your behavior is nudged in very soft ways by the big data. So I'm not sure that in the future personal choice is as crystal pure as it has been in the past. Sorry, it's like a storm. So I want to show a video, a very short video.
focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
I think I should really call this the Marmite talk, because like Marmite, people either really like it or they really, really hate it. And I think the reason people feel passionate about it is because what I'm going to be talking about is something which is so personal to us, namely the experience of this thing that we call the self. Now, defining the self is in itself a very difficult problem, because the language we use is problematic. The idea of there being an object and a subject of self, again, is logically difficult to conceive of. But what I really want to address today is what is the common, I think, perception of self. If you ask someone in the street about themselves, they will tell you a potted history and autobiography. They may tell you that they like certain things, or they might be able to describe their current phenomenological consciousness and experience in the present moment. And what I'm going to say is those accounts of this individual, this character, this integrated, coherent entity is illusory. Now, that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. People misconceive or misinterpret, I think, the term illusion. What illusion really means is it's not what it seems. And what I'm hoping to convince you of this at this lunchtime is that this sense of the self is something which is constructed by our brains. So the first premise is that the external world is simulated by our brains. We have no direct contact with reality. We're continually processing the information through our senses, and we're storing this in our brain. And so we have representations of the external world, and then we have representations that we store, that we bring to bear when we're thinking about and trying to understand the world around us. But we have no direct contact. Everything is filtered through this wonderful biological computer, the brain. So what do I mean by an illusion? Well, this is a very famous one. It's simple, but it's very sophisticated, in my opinion. It's the Konica illusion. Now, if you look at this, you have this overwhelming, hopefully, impression that there's a white square sitting above the four circles. But of course, there is nothing there at all. Now that's a visual illusion, and now that I've told you that, you still see the square, and that in itself is an interesting point, that when you have insight into the illusion, it doesn't necessarily eradicate it. But here's something which I think is really quite interesting. If I was to go into your brain, to the visual processing area at the back of your brain, I can find these specialized cells that we'll talk about in a moment, called the neurons. Now, neurons, they respond, and I could find neurons which are responding to edges of squares. But the interesting thing, the same neuron which responds to an edge would also respond to this illusory edge. So what that means is that the brain interprets this arrangement and comes up with a solution, that this must be a white square above four circles. And then, if you like, sends down information lower into the system saying there's an edge there, so fire as if it's really there. So the hallucination is to all intents and purposes, real. So I want you to watch carefully and tell me what you think this man is saying.
Ba, 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 ba.
Well, hands up if you've heard him say da, 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 da. Great, and you probably would put money on that. Now, I'm going to play the same piece again, but close your eyes and listen carefully.
Ba, 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 ba.
Hands up if you heard ba, ba. Good, your hearing's perfect. He is actually saying ba, ba. Now, there is proof that your phenomenological experience cannot really be trusted. You have no direct contact with reality, okay? Your brain takes the auditory signal, which is ba, and then we superimpose the visual signal ga. You have no representation of your brain for that sound and that vision, so your brain comes up with a solution, and that's constructed, okay? It's not real. Okay, so this is me. This really is me, actually. This is my brain from one of our studies. And everything I am, my fears, my anxieties, my humor, my everything, my memories, is somehow stored and computed in this 3-pound lump of tissue. But obviously, this thing, Bruce, I didn't pop out of my mother's womb as Bruce. I had to become Bruce, didn't I? So I think there's something to be said about development. How does the brain eventually become what we recognize as the individuals? Well, one way to think about it is to draw a distinction that William James did between the experience of I, which is the conscious phenomenology of who I am in the present moment, with me, which is the autobiography, the history of who I am. And so I would think it's quite plausible that very young infants may have conscious awareness. Well, I'm sure they do, in fact. So I think they've got the I experience, but they don't necessarily have the me experience, which is the history. So how do I and me become Bruce? Well, it must be something to do with the way that we store information and the networks which make up the kind of higher processing levels of the brain. These are the neurons. This is a diagram. And they're all connected up in this massive parallel system which are exchanging communication through these nerve impulses. And when the world imposes upon you, this sets up these chains of activation, patterns, and these become stored. And it's these stored patterns or representations is basically the language of the brain. And you've got a lot of them, about 86 billion of them. Now what might surprise you is that very young babies also have about 86 billion neurons. But what they lack is all the connections between the neurons. And it's the connections between the neurons which provides the immense processing power of the brain. What actually happens over experience is these connections become strengthened. This is driven by two processes. The brain is given biological information to simply sprout out all these connections, but the environment works to strengthen those which are stimulated. So if they're firing together, they're wiring together. And another kind of turn of phrase neurobiologists say, if you don't use them, you lose them. So in this way, the brain is becoming sculpted through the experiences of the early environments. This explains a number of interesting phenomena. For example, we're very good at telling faces apart, though not often when it comes to someone like Robin Ince, who's this more famous comedian. I'm often mistaken for him, and indeed I've actually autographed his books, much to the annoyance of his fans. But we can tell faces apart very readily, unless they're from a different race. If we haven't been exposed to another race, we find it quite hard. That's why we say they all look alike. We certainly find it harder to tell sort of monkey faces apart. But what might interest you is that if you take very young babies, they have no problem telling different race faces apart, or indeed they can tell the difference between monkeys quite easily. But with experience, they become tuned in to their environment. The environment is shaping the representations they have in their brain. So I've been talking about perception, but the talk today is really about the self. And so what we need to think about is what the brain does socially, because we're increasingly coming to understand that many of the sophisticated aspects of the brain are really all to do with something about getting on with each other. And I think one of the most interesting aspects about the social brain is I believe it must be shaped through this early experience of social interactions. We're all born with this tendency to want to look after our young, to nurture them, because I don't think it's any coincidence, but humans have proportionally the longest period as infants in comparison to any other social animal. And it's not that we're just exchanging information or passing on knowledge from one generation to the next. I think this is a mechanism to make us become social. And if you raise them in isolation, we know from the work of Harry Harlow, this can have a detrimental effect. So it's not the fact they're not getting food or they're not being kept warm. Harlow demonstrated that if you raise them and nurture them, then rhesus monkeys will end up with profound problems of socialization. And the same thing happens with humans. So babies are born to be social from the start. We respond to them socially, and they respond back to us this way. They will cry, they have empathy. When they hear crying, they will cry themselves. They will seek to soothe and share. They will directly try to interact with adults to get a rise out of them. And in fact, that's what babies do. Anyone who works with young children and babies realizes that the focus of attention are not the toys, it's not the television, it's other humans. That's the most interesting thing to a baby. And of course, they grow into become toddlers. Now, I'm not suggesting that they just are pro-social or promiscuously social. They tend to be kind of they're focusing in on those individuals or those adults which are responding to them. Now, of course, as we develop over these early years, we're becoming individuals. We initially start off as being the focus of our parents' attention, but then we have to learn and change socially. We have to get on with siblings, we have to get on with peers, we're becoming part of the tribe. And this ability is subserved by various systems. So we can recognize who we are. This is a classic kind of Rouge test. You know, that babies around about 18 months start to recognize the image as a reflection of themselves. This is an ability which is shared with other social animals, including dolphins and elephants. They're developing what we call a theory of mind, which is this ability to imagine someone else's perspective, to be less egocentric. And this is really important because if you want to kind of get on in a group and then manipulate others, you have to sort of understand or imagine what they may be thinking. But really what's important, and this is something I think has been underestimated, is the importance that we put on other people's opinions of ourselves. I think children are increasingly becoming self-conscious over the middle childhood period to the point of adolescence where they're obsessed by what other people think about them. It's less what the parents think, it's more what their colleagues, or their peers I should say, are thinking. So we're on this path to becoming adults, and we're mimicking, copying, integrating all the time. And then we're taking our lead from those around us. Initially this may be our parents, But increasingly, as our social circles broaden, we have to take into consideration the other people in that group. Self-control is something that children have to learn, and remarkably, their ability for self-control predicts how they behave later as adults. For example, those who can delay gratification, as we say, turn out to be more socially competent. They're also much better at school. They perform better in school, they're less disruptive, and they're also emotionally more stable. In fact, their performance at 4 years predicts whether or not they become drug addicts later on in 20 years of time. So why is this important? Well, if you think about the brain as a constellation of systems, and this is why I don't think there's any self as such, you have all these drives, all these motives, all these contexts, all these things trying to kind of take control, but they have to be regulated. If you're going to be socially responsible, you know you've got to control your aggression and all the other things, and that's what being antisocial is all about. And these are regulated by these sort of supervisory systems of the frontal parts of the brain, which, by the way, undergo major maturation around about 3 to 4 years of age. So you're regulating your behavior all the time. Now, who is this regulator? Is there somebody sitting in the frontal lobes which is controlling it? Is there a self operating this machine like some sort of captain of a ship? Well, no. And yet I think that's what many of us experience or think. We feel we're in control of our bodies. We see our bodies as a vessel. We can see it aging in the mirror when we pass every year and look at ourselves. But we still feel that we're an integrated, coherent, cohesive individual. And I would suggest that that is part of this illusion that the brain creates. Rather, I think this is probably a better way of thinking about the self. This is the numbskulls, for those who are old enough to remember this comic. And I'm not suggesting there's lots of little homunculi. What I'm saying is that there are lots of slave systems, subsystems, which are working autonomously. And the output of those systems is somehow fed up and coordinated into the sense of the self. Now, we know this is true from the work of people like Gazzaniga and Roger Sperry, who were working with patients who, they basically had epilepsy, and so one of the ways to treat that is to separate the two halves of the brain by cutting through the corpus callosum. And now you have a brain which is effectively in two halves. So in one of their studies, they got the patients to fixate on the center of the screen and projected two different words. The word key into the left visual field and the word key into the right field. Now, due to the way that the pathways cross over, the word in the left field is processed in the right side of the brain, and the word in the right field is processed in the left. And when asked to say, well, what do you see? Because language is on the left side, they simply said ring. But when asked to pick up the object from the table with their left hand, which is controlled by the right side of the brain, they picked up the key. Now, the interesting thing is that when they were asked to try and explain their actions, what Gazzaniga found was that people would confabulate an account to make sense of it. They made up a story to make sense of this inconsistent information. We do this all the time. Here's a simple study. You can ask people which is the most attractive woman in this task, and then you point to one of them, and the experimenter can actually switch them over and give you the opposite card, so you don't realize they've been surreptitiously switched. And when that happens, people tend to come up with an explanation of why they chose that person. So they seem unaware that they've just actually had their choice switched. We have this compulsion to try and make sense of the inconsistencies. And I think this inconsistency explains cognitive dissonance. We have a story about who we are. We have this idea that we're a good person, or we've got a sense of humor, or we have some moral standing. And when we're confronted with circumstances which seem to conflate with that or conflict with that, we'll reinterpret the circumstances to maintain this consistency. I think it also explains some of the classic examples in social psychology where people behave in ways which seem out of character of having a self. There's Ash's conformity studies. Basically, if 11 people say black is white, you're likely to agree with them. There's the work of Milgram. I'm sure you're aware of this, that most people think they wouldn't ever hurt or harm somebody to a great degree, but if the circumstances are right, people can find themselves indeed doing that. And then there's Zimbardo's work showing that if you just arbitrarily separate people into in-groups and out-groups, they behave badly against them. And of course, these experiments have real-world applications in many examples where people just do things which just seem so uncharacteristic. What's going to happen to the self with the new technologies? Because we're at a time in our evolution where we now have the capacity to extend ourself, to communicate ourself to a vast audience, never before in a two-way interaction. We think we're individuals on the web, but if you look at our behavior, this is an example, it's a plot of Twitter communication, people segregate into these groups. Even though they feel they're individuals, they basically are forming around collective ideas. I just want to end by saying that when you ask people at the end of their lives, what is your last regret, or what do you regret the most? This is the analysis of from Bronnie Ware's work. The one thing that people say is that they don't feel they ever lived a true self. So whilst we might deny the existence of self, I think we have this constant notion that we're being pulled by all the circumstances in our life, and we feel that we don't actually have the autonomous control. And I think we need to think about that autonomous control. I'm not suggesting that we're blank slates. Clearly we inherit something from our parents. People have different personalities. Anyone who's raised children knows that if you treat them the same, they still end up as individuals. But it's that individuality within the social environment which I think shapes us. And if you take away all that contextual information, then I would argue that you could effectively lose your identity of who you are.
But at one level, as your book argues in a sense, there is something kind of perverse about this trick that we play on ourselves, and we use phrases, very odd phrases, like I said to myself. That's a fantastic, who is this conversation between? But